Okay, everybody. Thank you for coming. Oh, look at this. It's transcribing everything I say. That's weird.
You can click that off. There's like an X at the top where
Today, for today's brown bag, I am going to talk briefly about um, policing black hair in both sports and society. So, do we still, this will still just pop my slides? No.
No, I think you have to use probably that to. The arrow at the bottom. Yeah, right there. Glad you're here.
Okay. So before the hurricane came and ravaged our campus, distracting most of our community and all of our white community, there was a disturbing incident on North Campus that generated hundreds of thousands of responses on social media and is now, for many around the country, the only way they know about Valdosta State University. The VSU baseball coach, Greg Gilliams, was recorded berating one of his players for not cutting his hair short enough, despite the fact that others on the team have hair longer than his. The coach, this is not the best setup.
Yeah.
The coach used the player's unwillingness to cut his hair as a justification for his not being allowed back onto the baseball team. Social media erupted. National media outlets like the New York Post, Bleacher Report, and others covered the story. Many Black alumni were incensed. Black parents have threatened to pull their students from VSU in favor of a less racist campus within the USG. Many others have promised that their high schoolers will not be allowed to come to VSU. Some students now on campus are planning to transfer. All of these people understand that individual racist acts don't indict everyone at the university as being racist. But they rightly argue that if there are no repercussions for such racism, if the university just ignores the problem, as it has done in the past with other racist incidents on campus, then the university itself is justly indicted as being infected with a systemic racism that is openly hostile to its Black students. And it is. Lack of action is a form of aggression. In a school with a Black student population of almost 40%, a faculty that is 90% white, and an administration that is even whiter, the attempt to ignore racial incidents is rightly seen as an endorsement of them. The publicity was only worsened by the response of the coach, who blamed the Black student for being a generically bad person, rather than saying anything about the actual words he was recorded as using. It has left students feeling that the administration could care less about them. It has left the faculty frustrated that an administration that constantly talks about admission rates, student retention, and the Blazer Creed don't actually care about any of that, as their own actions and inactions are themselves the largest detriment to admissions and retention. And there is neither civility nor respect in covering up the abuse of our students. The incident and lack of action by the university is rooted in a series of histories. The troubled history of race in Valdosta, the problematic legacy of racial incidents on the VSC and VSU campus, and the even longer history of racial discrimination based in white criticisms of Black hair. You may be familiar with the first two, as residents of Valdosta and members of the VSU community. And if not, those are certainly subjects we can discuss another day. But the third often hides in plain sight for those not directly affected by this kind of coded bigotry. Of course, I say coded, but through much of American history, there was nothing coded about it. Black hair has, since the colonial period, been overtly used by white people in power to demean those they deemed inferior to them. It is a story early predicated on what was known as the Great Chain of Being, wherein humans created a hierarchy of existence on the earth. At the top was God, then humans, then animals, then plants. But within those categories, the penchant for categorization continued. There were better or worse humans, just as there were better or worse animals. Rich humans were higher on the chain than poor ones, just as lions were higher on the chain than pigs. And eventually, race comes into the great chain of being. White humans are always going to be higher than black humans. From the earliest days of the Atlantic slave trade, the shearing of black hair was part of the seasoning process designed to create dehumanized docile automatons. Many 17th century naturalists referred to the hair of Africans as fur or wool, comparing it directly to that of those farther down the chain of being. It allowed them to create further distinctions within the chain, arguing that since people of African descent had hair characteristics closer to animals, then white humans would always be higher on the chain of being than black humans, who were, in the minds of many writers, closer to great apes than they were to white humans. This also created perceived hierarchies among slaves themselves, as those with straight hair that appeared closer to that of white people were seen as functionally closer to white people on the chain and were often given jobs within white homes rather than gang agricultural labor. Parenthetically, I should add that that often wasn't a gift, as those straighter hair types and house roles, particularly for Black women, made them more desirable to white owners and led to myriad sexual assaults. I think it's important to note that even though Black hair has always been used as a tool of white supremacy was so much bigger than that and would find a way to work whatever type of hair existed. And when the colonial period ended, despite the hue and cry of white colonists for liberty and freedom, slavery remained because white supremacy was always part of the colonial project. After the revolution, Louisiana was still a colonial possession of the Spanish. And in 1786, Governor Esteban Miro created the Tignon Law, which required Black and Creole women to wear headscarves in public to cover their hair. The law had many purposes. It was intended to stop interracial relationships and to publicly place free Black women in the same basic category as slaves. But it was also argued that the hair of Black women was, quote, insulting or unattractive to white people. Meanwhile, both slaves and free Black residents of the new nation wore their hair in braids and cornrows. They pressed it or wore it decidedly long, using their hair to express their difference and dignity, their opposition to white hegemony. Like skin color or other physical features, hair was a mark of distinction that could be celebrated just as easily as it could be castigated. But it was also, unlike skin color and other physical features, something that could be changed, modified to become a form of expression in a world that limited the expressive possibilities of Black voices. For white people, hair was a way to denigrate Blackness. For Black people, hair was speech. It was culture. And it could be a form of defiance, a reclamation of humanity. And these ideas on both sides of the racial divide were so ingrained in slavery that they remained largely unchanged after its diminution, with the one major change being that since Black workers now had to apply for jobs, white business owners could make policing Black hair a condition of employment, forcing white standards on Black workers simply as a function of the ability to survive. that kind of repression would become part of the Cultural Revolution as part of the late civil rights movement, moving forward into the 20th century. In the 1950s and the early 1960s, Black hair as an expression of non-white individuality, it really wasn't featured as part of the movement. One that was built largely on respectability politics. Black activists in the early stages of the classical civil rights movement were attempting to demonstrate their suitability to be included in restricted white spaces. So hair deviations were not really a part of it. But after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so many realized that integration, that inclusion in those spaces was not a cure-all for the bigotry that they experienced. And that so much of integrationist politics was built on Black conformity to white standards. The example I usually give in my class is of salt and water. So if I have a glass of water and a handful of salt, I can integrate the salt into the water. And it can be together, they can be integrated, but the salt disappears. It's there, but you can't see it. It has conformed to the standard. And so this new emphasis of the movement for an expansion of rights wasn't going to be about access to white buildings. It was instead on maintaining Black culture, customs, economy, and autonomy. And so beginning in the mid-1960s, hair again became, as it had in slavery, a malleable way to perform culture, push back against white hegemony, and demonstrate Black autonomy. It was a way to remain salt in a sea of whitewater. Braids, cornrows, natural hair in the form of afros and other styles, along with, for men, a variety of facial hair as well, became a public rejection of received white culture, a visible demonstration of Black power. And Black power in particular is going to have a substantial influence in athletics. The 1968 Olympic boycott didn't take hold, as its founder, Harry Edwards, and the Olympic Project for Human Rights had hoped, but it did include star players like Lou Alcindor of UCLA, who would soon become Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Though Tommy Smith and John Carlos did participate in the Olympics, their national anthem protest after the 200-meter dash spread the Black power message around the world and inspired a generation of Black athletes to use the platform they had to advocate for Black liberation. And one of the easiest ways to do that, in a field where most of those in it are seen far more than they are heard, was to use hair to express themselves, to declare their autonomy and their support for the movement writ large. It was a form of visual protest and individuality that was met with mixed reception from a predominantly white conservative fan base. Long before Laura Ingraham told LeBron James to shut up and dribble in response to the basketball star's support for protests against police brutality, white fans and commentators were, in their own way, telling players to shut up and dribble. But Black players would not be cowed by attempts at white policing. And the best of coaches realized that such policing was actually part of the problem. Bo Schembechler is the famed white football coach of the University of Michigan. He described his own relationship with Black hair and individuality. His Wolverine football team had a rule that required short haircuts, no facial hair, part of a disciplinary regimen relatively common in sports teams. And he was initially angry that in the late 1960s, his Black players refused to abide by the rules. But when he confronted one of his players And the player explained the role that facial hair and afros held for his identity and his participation in the movement for Black liberation. Schembechler demurred. He explains in his autobiography that it wasn't his culture. It wasn't something he understood, so it wasn't his business to police the hair of his Black players. And the Michigan coach was not in the vanguard of progressive thought or politics in any way. He never moved into such a role. He just understood that making rules about things he didn't understand was counterproductive and would only keep some of his best players off the field. Around the same time, in 1967, the American Basketball Association was founded as a rival to the NBA. In an attempt to counter-program its more conservative rival, the ABA openly celebrated Black expression in both play and dress. Slam dunks were legal in the league, unlike in the NBA where they were still illegal. And Black hairstyles and facial hair were welcomed as part of the league's aesthetic. The willingness of Black athletes to stick to their guns, to defend their right to express themselves, to not conform to white standards, while demonstrating that those standards had nothing to do with their ability to do their jobs, paid real dividends in amateur athletics, college athletics, and professional athletics. Even as white conservatives continued propagating racist jeremiads, telling players in so many words to shut up and dribble. But our particular problem at BSU comes in baseball, a sport with its own long and troubling racial history. Infamously segregated by a 19th century gentleman's agreement that kept the major leagues white until 1947, Black players participated in the Negro Leagues for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the peak periods of those leagues coming from 1920 to 1931, and again from 1933 to 1948. Black participation in the game fundamentally changed it, making it a far more competitive, far more athletic contest. Perhaps the culmination of that integrationist project in baseball came in the Pittsburgh Pirates of the 1970s, led by Bill Robinson, Dave Parker, and Willie Stargell. The Pirates experienced a run of success spurred by Black stars willing very much to celebrate their Blackness through afros and facial hair. The team won the World Series in 1971, then again in 1979. That 1979 team is known as the We Are Family team because they adopted the Sister Sledge anthem, We Are Family, as their theme song. That team started a majority Black roster, and they were able to bring some of that cultural expression of the ABA to Major League Baseball for the first time, winning the championship as they were doing it. Other teams, like the New York Yankees, were far more conservative. The team's owner, George Steinbrenner, had, like many other teams, a rule against long hair and facial hair for his players. But then he was able to sign one of the game's brightest stars, Reggie Jackson, from the Oakland Athletics. Jackson was no radical, but he did still have his own ideas about cultural expression and refused to abide by Steinbrenner's arbitrary rules, particularly in an age of the Pittsburgh Pirates. If the Yankees wanted to win, they needed Reggie Jackson, and so the Yankees changed the rules. Like the Wolverines before them, Steinbrenner did not become a progressive advocate for equality in any way. He never manned the barricades for the rights of minorities. But he realized that arbitrary rules that tended to punish Black expression more than it did white players were stupid, counterproductive, and ultimately discriminatory. Which brings us back to today. The high watermark of Black American players in Major League Baseball left with the 1970s, as more and more Black athletes migrated to football, basketball, and other sports. Today, less than 8% of Major League Baseball players are African American. Much of the whiteness of the professional game is bred by the NCAA, an organization that regulates the scholarships of college baseball programs and gives the sport far fewer than it does for basketball or football. Which means that high school athletes who know they will need athletic scholarships to attend college tend to gravitate toward football and basketball because the NCAA has set up the system to funnel players to those games. And whether Black collegiate athletes play baseball, football, or basketball, they are, like their forebears who watched with awe and respect at Black Olympians and professionals who use their platforms as vehicles of protest and expression, they seek to do much the same. The protests against police brutality that have continued apace for the last decade, but found their apotheosis in the summer of 2020 in response to the murder of George Floyd, sparked a series of protest gestures from professional athletes, particularly in the WNBA and the NBA, wherein players participated in a variety of activisms and wore supportive t-shirts in their warm-ups, prompting Ingram into her racist screed. Or perhaps one of her many racist screeds. And there is no question that in many instances, the racists still win in modern sports. David Stern, the former commissioner of the NBA, instituted a dress code for NBA players early this century in order to limit Black expression and whiten the image of the league, a rule that has thankfully since been repealed. Colin Kaepernick has been forced out of the NFL simply for kneeling during the national anthem as his own form of quiet, respectable protest. Our own beloved Atlanta Hawks have gone through a series of racial tumults surrounding efforts to make the attending fan base more white. And of course, the Braves moved the team out of Atlanta to predominantly white Cobb County. And then there's the issue. 2 days after the video of the racist incident with our baseball coach appeared on social media, the athletics department sent out a ticket solicitation email that featured several Black football and basketball players with long dreadlocked hair. It pointed out to many what Bo Schembechler learned in the 1960s, that arbitrary rules based on appearance tend almost uniformly to be bigoted based on race. It is a form of white control that has been modified in various ways over the years, the decades, and the centuries, but it has its roots in the racial bias of white sports leaders responding to having to participate with Black athletes in their games. And really, its even deeper roots go back to the proclamations of the early naturalists, who distinguished Black inferiority by linking Black hair to a problematic and lesser station on the great chain of being. Almost as if those early Atlantic slave traders turned to their charges and to Black athletes in the 21st century, screaming through the years in their own way, shut up and group. Thank you, everybody. That is the talk. I have included here on this slide some statistics about Black hair discrimination. I don't know why it's not like showing it like more broadly so that you can actually read some of it. Maybe if I just do this, it'll be a little bit bigger. I wish it just showed the picture of the slide. But anyway, you can see here 80%, 86% of Black teens have experienced some form of hair discrimination. Many Black women feel social pressure to straighten their hair for their jobs. All of these facts have been called specifically, I didn't call them, they were specifically called for the passage of what was called the Crown Act, an effort to try to eliminate hair discrimination in the workplace in general. But they all demonstrated that it is a problem that continues as white people try to impose a certain set of values onto anybody who is under their control, and all of those values are white. It is the whitewater trying to eliminate the Black salt. over and over again. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I have a couple questions. So,
What was the most interesting thing you learned during this project?
no,
Okay.
that's a good question. My biggest concern is what we can do to counter this, because the faculty speaking up against it has had no effect. And
That's true.
how do we get the administration to listen to our concerns?
Well, they're going to end up listening after our application rate drops, and things like that. But that's what it's going to take. They have shown historically that they don't really care what we think. But I mean, I'm framing this in the history of bigotry towards black hair, but I could have done a whole thing on framing it in relation to the bigotry that has existed on Valdosta State's campus, going from the Ku Klux Klan Jimmy John's incident back to EJ walking on the flag, back to everything else that has happened on this campus over the last 15 years that they have never done anything about. Never. They ignore all of these incidents in particular and just let it ride. And then they say, Blazer Creed, we care about integrity, but they really mean that they want a certain kind of student and that student is white. And it's a real problem because within the decade, we're going to be a majority black institution as far as our students go. And to have all of these white administrators making completely racially insensitive responses to these kinds of, or non-responses, I think is probably the best way to say that, is kind of productive to the exact trend with where we are going as a university. That is the only thing they're going to listen to. Money. They don't care what we say. Yeah.
Kind of on that note, you think the lack of response is related to the general whiteness of academia?
Yes and no. The general whiteness of academia is its own problem. And I think if our faculty looked more like our student body, which it should, I still think white administrators would ignore us. So that is a whole separate problem, and that is a problem that has to be addressed and has to be fixed. But until we start thinking beyond black faculty and we start thinking about black administration at the highest levels, I don't know how that's going to change. And for VSU, we get our upper administrators handed to us. In our last several presidential searches and things, the people that the faculty have chosen to be our new president have all been rejected in favor of candidates that we rejected. And so if the faculty doesn't get a say in that, and it's going to be left up to a predominantly white board of regents that is appointed by conservative politicians in Atlanta, I don't think that would have a particular bearing on this case, because an increased black faculty, which we do have a control of and which we are complicit in not producing a better faculty for, still would be voiceless in these kind of situations. They would still be ignored by the people who listen. If they don't listen to my emails, I don't imagine they would listen to other people's, just because they don't really concern themselves with that. And my greatest fear is that even more than faculty student ratios as far as race goes, the real thing that they're going to use here is the hurricane, and use that to just ignore this and say, well, we'll just use the sympathy from that, and we'll just pretend this never happened. The problem is it's easy for white administrators to pretend something doesn't happen because they don't have to be in a space that is constantly aggressive towards them. And so when they forget, they just assume that everybody else forgets. They don't realize that is not the way forgetting works. And until we make them understand that, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm very nervous that nothing will. And that can't be the case. There has to be some, even if it is a token response, we have to do something at the administrative level to show we actually care about our Black students, because otherwise our enrollment's going to go down. Black students are rightly going to transfer to some other school in the USG that doesn't shit on them all the time. And they're going to come to us in meetings next fall and say, our enrollment's down, we're cutting our budget, everything is bad. And we're going to say, we know it's all your fault. And I think as the student movement of the 1960s showed, I think sometimes students believe, partially because of those disparities in faculty race numbers, that it is them versus the faculty and the administration. Historically speaking, that has never been the case. From the 1920s, when we start to see the first real viable protest on college campuses, all the way through the protest movement in the 1960s, the dynamic is always the students and the faculty against the administrators. We are always on your side. And to the point of not even being in our own best interest. I mean, and so I think one of the most important things we can do is to communicate to you guys that we are on your team, that we are on your side, and that collaboration between faculty and students doesn't have to just be classroom stuff. We very much want you. We have your best interest in mind as well. We're here for you, and if you feel like the people who you are disconnected from, i.e., the administrators who just kind of sit over in their little world over there and try to ignore these things, are frustrating you, that we are outlets for that, and that even though they don't listen to us either, we can help and we can make your voice louder with ours. And I feel like a lot of students don't realize that because they just see we're all the old people and so we're all on the same team, and that is not the case. Um, and so I think that kind of collaboration might help, but other than that, I'm not sure. The blackening of faculty, that's a long process. I mean, that is a decades long process. By the time we get to that point that we are actually doing the way we should be doing on that, you'll be long out of college. We need to be working on that. But at the same time, we need to make sure that the years you spend here are actually as equalitarian as they can be. And those are two vital things, but they are separate tracks, I think. And from in a variety of ways, we're not doing either one of them very well.
I think like the people up top, like it's easier for them like to like just ignore like what Black students go through because like they don't relate at all. Cause like when it comes to like I guess them it's just like it's just hair or it's just like cause with me personally with my hair too, like when I wear it in afro and in natural state, a lot of times I do feel like I'm being judged by other people.
Right.
So it's like it's when I'm not in like a Black space, like I feel like they might think it looks unruly or they might think it looks like this. Like even when I go for like job interviews and stuff like that, a lot of times I'll have my hair braided or like maybe like straightened because I feel uncomfortable. But like they never felt like that, so they don't think it's an actual problem. I think
Right.
that's what it is.
Absolutely. That is a real problem. Inability to relate. And if you can't relate, so I'll never be able to relate, partly because I have white hair and partly because I'm losing all my hair. But which is its own problem. But so to compensate for that, because I know that I can never embody that space, you learn about it. and you learn about that history and you create contextual models for yourself so that you can never claim to know, but you can at least track how this goes to make that make sense for you. You can still be white and understand this. You just can't experience or feel it, but you can know the history of it. The problem is that whereas the professoriate is here to both teach you things, but also to learn new things and to write new things and to be immersed in the whole production of knowledge that happens at universities. Administrative people really aren't. They're here to kind of run a business, and they're not really here to do that. And their number one goal is to make sure that all the donors to the school are happy. And even though the number of Black students is increasing every year, the number of influential donors in Valdosta is white as the snow, and with the racial attitudes of Valdosta people. And so they are walking a line between trying to ensure that there is as little controversy as possible, but at the same time that their donors will continue to give them money. And that does not make an adequate situation for learning.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. I was gonna say like a lot of people, a lot of them, like they can learn, but they don't care and they don't want to learn at the same time.
Right. I mean, it doesn't fit with the business model.
They're not here.
They're there for a reason. We used to staff our administrative positions in universities, actually for much of the history of American universities, with faculty members who continued to do faculty work while they were administrating. We have moved to this kind of proto-capitalist model of universities wherein administrators are just these kind of middle managing people. And I should say, we've had way worse administrators. Our administrators at this school are decent people. I mean, we have had administrators at this school who were incarnations of the devil. These people aren't that. Our administrators, I think, tend to be decent folks. They don't, they're not involved in the academic project. They're not involved in learning about these things. And so it creates these blind spots that even when we yell from the rooftops to try to get them to do that, it's not what they're here for. They're there to make money. Making money is not the same thing as becoming part of the knowledge generation that universities do. Yes, ma'am.
So the whole affirmative action was overturned,
Mhm.
and I don't know if you know about, well, probably do, professor. There's there was a theory of like a post-Black political period where they're trying to, like, the whole idea behind their affirmative action was we don't see race as a society anymore. That's not necessary, even though affirmative action isn't just for Black people, it's for
Everybody.
right?
Right.
But that's what we think of. Do you think our response to this situation has been worsened by that current climate of being like in a post-race like post-Black?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because it gives everyone plausible deniability to say I'm treating everybody equal. Right. And because our white students who are just as valuable as everybody else, but have never had to deal with any, so I teach Black history as my main subject here that I teach. And my classes inevitably are more than 90% Black. It's not because all of our white students are bigots and they just don't care. It's because they see that as not being something that's for them. And that's set up by these attitudes that you're talking about, where we each have our own lane and we just stay in it. And that means that whenever disruptions happen, people tend to just stay in their lane and they don't cause the kinds of necessary upheavals that we need to get those kind of things changed. If this incident, for example, had happened in 1968, this campus would be on fire, and but students today don't do that, and it's not their fault. It is the way we compartmentalize these things. And even before we got rid of affirmative action, the Supreme Court started that by getting rid of the Voting Rights Act, which said we don't need protections for Black voters. Anybody can vote. And of course, immediately what happened is that places like Georgia started passing all these voter restriction laws. It was all a part of getting rid of the Black right to vote under the guise of equal opportunity. The same thing happens with affirmative action, equal opportunity, but it's really a guise to ensure that white men get the jobs. And that's what we see in academia too, with a heavy black student population, heavy white faculty and administrative. That's it. Yeah.
You mentioned like throughout the capitalist, how the administrators are being appointed. I don't want to say elected. And the same thing sort of applies when you're thinking of like the baseball and them with their first like black hires for their teams, because at the end of the day, the only reason they allow them on the team is because they'll make more money if they win. So it's kind of like, is it sort of a self-interest thing? Like Valdosta, there's no interest for, you know, this white system at this point to address it. So until there is a self-interest or there is a satisfaction in that like financial point or
It's
something
interesting.
like that, they're not gonna see any.
I have wondered about that myself.
Yeah.
The problem with that analogy is that our baseball team doesn't make money.
Yeah.
I go to the baseball games. There are 20 people there with me. I mean, there's nobody that goes. Our athletics department does not generate revenue.
Okay.
Our athletics department loses revenue. As a matter of fact, more than 90% of all college athletics programs lose revenue. Even Division I,
Yeah.
even the ones that are on TV all the time. UGA makes money,
Yeah.
but off their athletics program, but Georgia Tech doesn't, Georgia State doesn't, nobody else does in Georgia. Everybody loses money. And baseball in particular, if this were happening, let's say at UGA, and it were happening with football,
Yeah.
administrators at UGA would have an argument to make that we don't want to mess with this because football is the way that most people find out about our school. It is kind of the front porch of our university, and it allows people to come in. And so therefore, we're just going to let this go and let this happen. Not a great argument, but at least an argument that they could make. We can't do that. Nobody cares about our baseball team.
Yeah.
Nobody, not one single student has ever said, unless you're actually getting a scholarship, I want to come to VSU. I love that Blazer baseball team. I've dreamed of going to that school. Nobody has ever said that about VSU. Our athletics program is not revenue generating, and it is not student generating the way it is at big time D1 schools. And so the idea that we could use financial incentive as a proto justification for why these kind of things happen, it doesn't fit here. I mean, it wouldn't be a good argument to make even at UGA, obviously, but it would be an argument you could make. You can't make that argument here. And so it only makes us look worse because the stakes are so low. I mean, you know, there are no stakes, and yet we still don't want to do anything. That is more damning than it even would be at a place like UGA that has way more on the line.
Like a lot of times when it comes to like basketball versus like baseball, there's a lot more black students on like the baseball, on the basketball and the football team. So it's like
That is
the rules about someone's hair, like when it comes to basketball and football, will be like kind of dumb. I feel like because there's a lot more kids who have like locks or afros on those teams. But when it comes to the baseball team, it's like
Even on
like good
right.
one or two black kids on the baseball team. So I feel like there's a big difference. When it comes to
That is exactly right. And if you are part of an athletics department and there is a different standard for each sport, and that sport and those standards are decidedly built around racial concepts that have existed for hundreds of years, and you're showing pictures to your would-be ticket buyers of other black athletes at the same school that have long dreadlocked hair, it's such a contradiction that it's almost impossible not, even if you were trying to bury your head in the sand, it would be impossible not to see. And it does create these kind of frustrations for everybody.
So you mentioned in the PowerPoint about like LeBron and other athletes speaking out
Yeah.
about yada yada. I don't know if you've ever read this concept, but there's some activists that argue that the black people in the media and the black people that have the, I don't want to say the funds, but like have the reach to travel and to make those statements, they don't speak for, not they don't speak for the black community because they still have the same experiences, but
Right.
at the end of the day, like you are still not living like 60% of the black people in poverty, right? So you are not like, and so they're kind of like portraying this idea that like the black population has the same opportunity, not same opportunity in America, but they had that opportunity to succeed. And they have, or they're showing that to the rest of the world. Is there like a danger in that? If that's the only thing people are seeing are the successful black people in America, they're like, well, what are you complaining about? You know, he's on TV, he's making $1 million. That's the only understanding they have of the black population in America. How does that?
Well, right, and it goes even worse than that because those successful black representatives are only in certain areas of life, and so we assume black success looks like athletics, it looks like hip hop, it looks like certain kinds of movies, and so when that becomes the standard for what black success is, then it automatically discourages black success in STEM
Yeah.
or history or other things like that because black success looks like a very certain way. You can see white successful people all across the board, and they are portrayed that way in fictional accounts. But if you see a fictional account of an athlete who is playing basketball but gets hurt, I guarantee you, I would bet everything in my pockets right now that in that fictional portrayal, the basketball player is going to be black. And the doctor who looks at his leg is going to be white. And there are those cultural codes, I think, are even more important than the actual individuals who get famous. I'm not going to, fault somebody for getting famous, especially when they're willing to make these kind of statements, even if you're right, they aren't representative. If they're willing to stick their neck out, that's awesome. But you're right, when all we see are black faces and all we hear are black voices coming from athletics, from hip hop, and from certain kinds of movies, then there generates this kind of not only assumption that other people can do it, so therefore you don't need affirmative action anymore, but also you can do it. And here are the places where we're going to allow you to do it. Athletics, music, theater, you can do that. Everything else we're going to have for us. And that becomes their version of affirmative action. That becomes their version of inclusion. And we have the same thing happens in university. I don't want to make it sound like we don't. We tend to pigeonhole all of our black faculty into African American studies departments. That is where you typically find universities hiring the most black faculty, not because there aren't black faculty in all kinds of other fields, but because universities tend to need a certain quota of minority hires to keep their state funding. And what better way to get them than just litter the Africana Studies program with black faculty who are, again, talking about their own experiences. And therefore, if that's the case, in the Africana Studies department, then other white people have the choice not to listen to them. And so by doing that, you create a kind of ghetto around certain parts of the faculty to get your quota, but not have to actually pay attention to them. And so it happens in the public sphere, but it also very much happens here where we are. Not here as in BSU necessarily, but I mean in the university project in general in the country.
And I feel like a lot of times when Black people, like when we're playing sports and we're singing or rapping, that white people are okay when we're like entertainers and stuff, but anything else like being doctors or
Right.
being lawyers, they're all like
Authorities.
yes, like anything
Any kind of
that really matters because sports and music, it's fun, it's cool, but it doesn't really matter. Like
It's not
teachers and
threatening
professors,
the white
yeah,
agenda.
like it's like they just see us as entertainment, but not as actual people. So when they actually stand up, take a stand, take a kneel, it's a problem.
That is exactly right. And that is specifically related to affirmative action and to white people's unwillingness to have their own authority threatened. Entertainers are fine, but people who are competing with me for a job are now hostile. And that hostility is going to play out. And if that's the hostility, then you look for various ways to demean your competition. And one of the ways you can do that,
No, affirmative action did help women as well.
it did.
It did. But I recently read about how, like,
Still didn't get them equal pay, but
no, that's, no.
it did help.
Maybe got them into college, so get paid less, but it's okay. What did I say? Women power. You were mentioning, it doesn't threaten the white power. I recently read how, contrary to popular belief, like, white women don't have the power in the system. They still serve the white man. And so that's how white women tiers are weaponized against Black people or Black men. I don't know if it's just Black
It's
men.
both. I think
Yeah,
both.
it's both.
It's
both.
it's been that way since the 19th century.
Yeah, it's just that power doesn't actually exist. Only for white people as a whole, it's only white men. And then there's the weaponization of that.
And the weaponization of that is real. I mean, the whole argument for women's right to vote in the South was we need white women to counteract Black votes. The whole reason we get a lynching phenomenon is because of the myth of Black male animalistic sexuality towards white women. White women have always been used as a cudgel against Black women and Black men. That is as old as the racial line being drawn itself in the late 17th century. And it always works to their um, uh, diminution in society. I mean, white women are always going to be defined out of a lot of those systems because they are, for non-white people, an assumed part of the white power structure. And for the white men in power, assumed not to matter. And so they disappear in a lot of these debates entirely. And it creates, like, I mean, we celebrate now because women's soccer gets paid the same as men's soccer, as if we should be celebrating. That should have just been the way it was. Women's soccer is 10 times more popular than men's soccer. And yet we celebrate this as kind of a victory. That wouldn't be celebrated as a victory if we didn't have those structural inequalities built into the way we view what counts as whiteness and what counts as power.
Here, especially if we're Black, kind of your response to seeing this video, and I know in his presentation he shared, on social media, different students saying different things, but does this, like, I was curious about, like, does this make you want to transfer to another university, or as we were talking about, if the administration is going to listen to anything, would they listen to the fact that, our enrollment continues to go down because it's like this? So I was curious. Else.
I'm an education major and I'm in classes that are teaching us like how to how to like deal with other cultures instead of just like putting everybody into the same box.
Yeah.
So I guess it's like it affected me seeing the video because like I've felt the exact same way before, just not in a sports setting. So it was like, a lot of times people are like, well, racism, it's not it, like it's gone now. That was back then. That was this, but it's the same thing. It just morphed into something else. So, I mean, of course, I'm not gonna transfer. Like I'm a freshman. Like I just got here, but it definitely moved me to see that the same thing was still happening. Like I know it, but it's like at my school. Like that's crazy. That's how I felt about it.
So for me, I'm a junior. I just transferred to VSU. I've always grown up in the South, so I hate to say it, but I was like, just like, oh, yeah, like that's just standard racism in the South. Like that's just the environment. That's just the nature of society is it's built upon racist principles. It is racist. People are racist. I'm in the deep South. That is what happens. Like,
Right.
it was not anything where I was like, I was just like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, okay. I will say, like, I'm not planning on transferring again, mainly because, like you said, a majority of the like student population is Black. Well, not a majority, but a large percentage.
Right.
And so, a lot of times, what happens with minorities is, in places where we're like oppressed or feel uncomfortable, we group together and that tightens our community. And so it's like, I'm in the South, no matter what, I'm also in America, it's gonna be racist. But knowing that there is 40% Black people on campus, there will be a community for me. So like,
Right.
it's like wherever I go, I'm gonna get like racially slurred. I'm gonna have a man throw trash at me through my drive-through. Like it happens. That's my life. Like I'm just Black in America. But knowing that there are so many Black students, that was the only like that's the only reason I'm not like, man, I really want to go home because like there's enough Black people here for me to not feel that threatened. I do think like yeah, like you said, administration's not gonna respond until when it comes time to enrollment numbers drop because then that's a problem. Who's gonna pay tuition and how's that gonna work? So yeah, they're not gonna care. Nothing's gonna be said until it comes time to re-enroll and people actually do transfer. I honestly like I hate to say it, I don't know if a lot of people will. Think I think there's always, for my generation, always a problem with kind of being, I don't want to say like afraid of like revolution, but like there's just this oh, I hate it here, this is terrible, I don't want to be here, I'm gonna leave. But then it comes time to do that, and we're not,
Right.
we're not ready to take those steps. And so and that's the problem. We're so used to like our status quo and being at VSU that we aren't actually gonna leave. And then enrollment will actually go down, and then administration will have nothing that will force them to respond, and then nothing has happened. And so that's just kind of the cycle. You know, something happens, people get a little jazzed up, but they can't really take any steps to do anything about it. And so if you don't take any steps to do anything about it, then you don't force the man in power to respond. And so that's just kind of life, to be honest.
And that is the way it has been with every racial incident on our campus for the last decade and a half.
Yeah.
And for people as old as I am, you're much younger than I am. That's sad because we went through all that. I mean, you were showing all those pictures, like, I remember that. I remember that.
Yeah.
And one of the revitalization of the hair that goes back is it goes back to a lot of African hairstyles that were recognized again here in the United States. And the interesting part of that is a lot of them are based on fractals. This is totally off the subject, but fractals were something that are centuries old in Africa. And for the white community in Europe, they didn't even find out about fractals till, the 1900s. And so the fact that that was brought back culturally should have been much more significant because it points to an advance that we saw in Africa that didn't exist in Europe. And so the advanced mathematics, the advanced natural geometry that we saw in indigenous groups. And instead of being impressed and recognized for that, it went the other way.
White folks didn't do it, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true, because a lot of things that were like built during like the time of slavery that a lot of Black people created, like stole it and patented it, and because we didn't know how to patent, we couldn't get it patented. It was so many things that were a problem.
Because all the people who administrated the patent office were white people, which is the danger when all the people who administrate a university are white people. It it creates those very same problems. And the theft here isn't of ideas, it is of people's comfort and their ability to learn the way they should be learning in an environment that is safe for them.
And you can see in the areas that become dropped from the curriculum. The ones that are
Yeah.
first cut are the ones that address these issues. And, you know, nobody even amongst some of the faculty, people were like, oh, that's a shame, but we're not really gonna be upset about it. So yeah, those who are really pushing these issues are right now across the United States. The departments are being closed. The University of Virginia,
West Virginia,
West Virginia.
just West Virginia, just
Oh, they
shut
just shut
everything.
down.
all of their languages.
everything that had to do with diversity and inclusion. And, you know, those are the departments that go first. Because it's assumed they're not important. All we need is, you know, qualitative data.
Yeah,
over.
thank you guys for coming. We really appreciate it. We do this once a month,
Yeah,
right? Don't we?
Yes,
We do
once
this
a
once a month. I don't know what we're doing next month, but
I don't remember yet.
feel free to come down.
We will be doing it twice, and that's
We
starting
were
next.
Asked to give this presentation to the athletic department. I wish.
I
That-
think I should. I think I should. I will happily do a seminar with the athletic department.
History of-
I'm sure they would love that.
That is my wish.
Listen, true story. One time,
Do you want this off the record?
oh yeah, turn that off. We were doing a panel on black athletes.
Still recording, just to let you know.
I'm trying
to get there.
And
Stop recording.
Oh, there it is. Okay, thank
Oh,
you.
you're not there yet.
Ah, too
and
many buttons.
there were a couple of football players,